Good morning, dear students. I am Professor Hazem Atlam. As you know, in our precedent course, we have begun to examine the United Nations organizations. And with this regard, we have examined, in one hand, the aims and the principles of the UN, as stipulated in Articles 1 and 2. And then we have examined how these aims and principles, by the stipulations of the UN Charter, are promoted by the principal organs of the UN. And with this regard, we have begun to examine the plenary organ, I mean the General Assembly. With regard to the General Assembly, we have examined, on one hand, the composition of the General Assembly, on the other hand, how does the General Assembly works with the stipulation of the General Assembly and the United Nations Charter. 3, the system of vote in the General Assembly. 4, the competences of the General Assembly. And lastly, the binding force of the resolution adopted by the General Assembly. Within our exam of the competences of the General Assembly, we have said that all the aims of the UN, with the exception of the competition of relating to the promotion of peace and security, are reserved only for the General Assembly. I mean, here we are within competences which cannot be examined within the UN Charter by the Security Council. But within the competence with regard of the promoting of the first aim of the UN, I mean the promotion of international peace and security, here we are within a concurrent competence between the General Assembly and the Security Council, and I think that we will examine this competence of the General Assembly when examining the same competence of the Security Council regarding this matter. Today we will examine then the Security Council. The other organs of the UN, as I have said in the last course, are excluded from the exam. I mean, from page 198, last paragraph, to page 220. And when examining the General Assembly, some pages has been also excluded from the exam. Today we will begin our examination of the Security Council. I mean, then in the book, from page 182, to page 198, from page 182 to page 198. And with this regard, some pages or some paragraphs are excluded from the exam. First of all, the second paragraph of page 185, the second paragraph, which begin with in 2003, 185, and also the first paragraph of page 186. Also, excluded from the exam. Excluded from the exam. The last paragraph of page 189. The last paragraph of page 189, where it is stipulated from 1945 to 1990, to page 193, before the last paragraph discussion. Before the last paragraph discussion. Then page 197 and page 198 and page 198. All these parts are excluded from the exam. What we'll examine now regarding the Security Council. And as I said in the beginning of this course, with regard to the competences of the Security Council regarding the promotion of international peace and security, we will make some comparison with the competences of the General Assembly regarding this matter. How will we examine the Security Council? First of all, number one, the composition of the Security Council. Number two, how does the Security Council work? The session. Three, what are the competences of the Security Council? Four, what is the system of vote for the adoption of resolutions in the Security Council? And lastly, what is the system of the binding force of the resolution adopted by the Security Council? Then 5 points we have here to examine. The composition of the Security Council. In fact, here, the Security Council is the executive organ of a universal organization. And then, as all it is in this universal organization, the principle is also promoted in the Security Council. Only some of the members of the UN organization are represented in the Security Council. The Security Council is the executive organ of an universal organization, and then here is composed of some only of the members of the organization. Then it is an organ of limited membership. Remembering together, when examining the general theory of IOs, what is the rule promoted for the election of these some states in the executive organ of a universal international organization? As I've said before, to promote and to respect the principle of equality, of sovereignty between the members of an international organization, a criteria is promoted here for the election of the states represented in the executive organ of the Universal International Organization. This one is the equal repartition by continents of the states who will be elected in the executive organ. The majority of the universal international organization adopt this criterion without exception, the majority, as UNESCO, as International Labour Organization and other international organizations. But as exception, in some universal international organization, that is the case in the International Bank, that is the case in the International Monetary Fund, and also in the UN, the composition of the executive organ is stipulated as to offer the possibility for the criterion of the equal repartition between continent, between state, plus another criterion. And this criterion is that of the quality of the state as being greater state, yes or no. And then the International Bank, International Monetary Fund, and also in the Security Council, we are within two groups of members. And in fact, they are 15 at all. Within the UN Charter, it is stipulated that the number of the states represented in the Security Council are 15 states, but distributed within two groups. Non-permanent members, they are 10 non-permanent members, and 5 permanent members, stipulated by their name as being greater states in the UN Charter. United States of America, Russia, Great Britain, France, and China. The other 10 are non-permanent members elected by the General Assembly, only by the General Assembly, for a mandate of 2 years. For a mandate of 2 years to represent the regional group in the UN. And examining these 10, we will see that we have 2 seats for African non-Arab states, 2 seats for Asian non-Arab states, 1 seat for an Arab state, 2 seats for Occidental non-permanent member states, 2 seats for Latino American states, and 1 seat for Eastern European states. Then it will be the General Assembly who elected these states for a mandate only of 2 years, and then another election for states coming from the same regional group. That is relating to the composition of the Security Council. And this distinction between non-permanent and permanent has been adopted from before the creation of the UN in the Conference of San Francisco, because in 1944, in the Conference of Dumbarton Oaks, between the 4 greatest allied states, they decided that this system will be adopted by the UN Charter. That is point number 1, the composition. Number 2, how does the Security Council work? How does the Security Council work? In session or within permanence? Here we are within the general principle existing in all international organizations as we have examined it within the general theory of IOS. The plenary organ meets only in a regular session, only once or twice a year, and that is a stipulation of the treaty creating the organization, which decide if the plenary organ will meet only one time in the year, that is the case in UN for the General Assembly, or twice, as it is in the Arab League Charter. For the executive organ, in all IOs, they work in permanence. They work in permanence. Why? Because the executive organ, as we know, has the ultimate competence to realize the aims of the organization. The aim of the UN Charter is to promote the international peace and security. Then, if we are within a crisis which constitutes a threat to peace, an act of aggression, here, even if we are within a conflict which doesn't constitute a threat to peace or an act of aggression, internal conflict or international conflict without distinction, here the executive organ has to meet quickly to examine this conflict in the aim to find for it a solution. And then, within the UN Charter, the Security Council works in permanence. The General Assembly then, with the stipulations of the UN Charter, must meet only in ordinary session once a year, and can, if a crisis will impose that, can meet in one irregular session within a positive vote of the simple majority of the voting states, only if we are within a crisis, as now, for example, within the crisis of Corona, we are in the month of March, the General Assembly can meet to examine this conflict in an irregular session, but can't meet in permanence. But in practice, after the creation of the UN, in fact, the General Assembly creates a subsidiary organ having the name of the small assembly. And this subsidiary organ meet all the year. Then here, the General Assembly, by creating this subsidiary organ, make some interference with the competence of the Security Council as being as the executive organ of the UN, having the ultimate right to meet all the year. This practice, by customary rule, has been considered as legal, and we consider that this small assembly is now a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly. Third point, what are the competences of the Security Council? The main competence of the Security Council relate to the promotion of the international peace and security. And we know from the precedent course that in the conference of the Dumbarton Oaks, the 4 great allied states reserved for the Security Council only to examine this problem and then avoid in their work that the General Assembly may examine any conflict relating to international peace or international security, despite the fact that the General Assembly is a plenary organ, I mean the organ having the competence to examine all the aim of the organization, as in all other IOs. But as I have said, in the Conference of San Francisco, Egypt and some Latino American states make this remark, and in the end, the aim relating to international peace and security by the disposition of the UN Charter become a competence common between Security Council and General Assembly, but within primary competences here for the Security Council, substantial competences for the Security Council in this matter, and within this, the competences of the General Assembly are more moderate. That is the main competence of the Security Council, as we will examine it. But as this competence is the exclusive one for the Security Council, no. In fact, for the admission, the suspension, and the exclusion of states from the UN, here we are within a concurrent competence between General Assembly and Security Council. 2, for the election of the judge in the International Court of Justice, here we are within a concurrent competence between the General Assembly and the Security Council. 3, for the election of the General Secretary of the UN, here also we are within a concurrent competence between General Assembly and Security Council. I will examine in point number 4 the system of vote in the Security Council relating to this matter, but now we examine these competences. Relating to the admission of new states in the UN, or suspension of the quality of member or exclusion of the member, I say that here we are within concurrent competence. But the question must be, first of all, examined by the Security Council, and never the General Assembly may examine it unless a positive vote in the Security Council, within at least a majority of 9 between the 15, including all the permanent member, will be adopted. And here, if it will be so, the General Assembly will be able to examine the question, and the admission, the exclusion, or the suspension may be arise, but by a vote in the General Assembly within 2/3 of the voting states. And in fact, because that is the Security Council who have the right to examine all this matter, first of all, after the creation of the UN, the Cold War began between 1946 and 1990, and for this effect, each one of them, US and Soviet Union, has had the custom, if a request is presented by an allied state of the Soviet Union, a veto by US, and if it is an allied state of the Soviet Union who want to be admitted in the UN, veto by the US, also for the question relating to suspension and exclusion. Never a member has been excluded from the UN or suspended in his quality of member because of the concurrent right of veto used to be in practice in the Security Council by these states. Relating to the election of the non-permanent member of the Security Council, as I have said in some moment, that is the exclusive competence of the General Assembly. That is only the General Assembly who elects by a vote of at least 2/3 the non-permanent member of the Security Council. But for the election of the General Secretary of the UN, first of all, a vote in the Security Council, and we request a majority of at least 9, including all the permanent members. And as you know, for example, lastly, our great professor and ex-General Secretary of the UN, Dr. Boutros Ghali, hasn't been in the possibility to receive a second mandate because of the right of veto of the United States of America. But if the Security Council votes yes for the election or the election, here we will be within the competence of the General Assembly to examine the matter. And for the question of the election of the General Secretary, it is required only a simple majority. Only a simple majority of the voting states in the General Assembly. For the election of the judge of the International Court of Justice, same dialectic, but in the Security Council, we does not request that we be within no veto. I mean that for the election of the judges of the International Court of Justice, here it is requested at least 9 positive votes without distinction if the 5 permanent members vote yes or no. Being now within the competence of the Security Council regarding the promotion of international peace and security. Here, in fact, the Security Council have to examine internal conflict, international conflicts, which affect international peace and security by direct or indirect way within one of 2 purposes. Within one of 2 purposes. The first one, if we are within a conflict which does not affect the persistence of the international peace and security, a conflict between 2 states, a conflict, I mean, which doesn't constitute a breach of peace, doesn't constitute an act of aggression, doesn't constitute a threat to peace, then, I mean, here we are within a peaceful conflict between 2 states. A peaceful conflict. As, for example, a conflict between Egypt and Sudan relating to the frontier between them, or a conflict between Egypt and Israel relating to the conflict between them, or a conflict between France and Germany relating to the frontiers between them, a peaceful conflict, Here, the Security Council may examine it. You can ask why. This conflict doesn't constitute a breach of peace, neither an act of aggression, nor a threat to peace. Why, within the disposition of the UN Charter, it is allowed to the Security Council to examine it? Only to prevent that this conflict, if it will not be resolved between its party, it may in the future constitute a threat to peace, an act of aggression, or a breach to peace. That is the first perspective. Here, is it possible, yes or no, for the General Assembly to examine conflicts which have these characteristics? Yes, within the dispositions of the UN Charter, it is allowed also to the General Assembly to examine them, but within one restriction. What is this restriction? It is not admitted for the General Assembly to examine one of these conflicts if, in fact, this conflict is examined effectively by the Security Council. Then, if one of these conflicts are not examined by the Security Council, in fact, the General Assembly can examine them. But if, after beginning to examine them, the Security Council will decide to examine them, here the General Assembly will have the obligation to stop examining them. That is within the stipulations of the UN Charter. In practice, after the creation of the UN, as this dialectic has been realized as so, in fact, a custom has been adopted in the General Assembly, by which it gave itself the right, even in the cases in which one of these crises are examined by the Security Council, gives itself the right to examine it by within another perspective. I give an example. Suppose that we are within a frontier conflict between Egypt and Sudan. Here, the Security Council will meet to find a solution to this problem. But in the same time, it will be possible for the General Assembly to examine the implications of this conflict, but not to find a solution to it. For example, deterioration in the relation between Egypt and Sudan, no exportation of goods from Egypt to Sudan. The General Assembly will try to find a way by which the goods of Egypt will be able to be received by the Sudanese people. Then that is the first perspective of examination by Security Council of matter relating to international peace and security. I mean here, conflict which does not constitute threat to peace, do not constitute bridge to peace, do not constitute also an act of aggression. The second perspective of examination of the Security Council of conflict relating to international peace and international security will be if we are within conflicts by themselves, having as a consequence to constitute a breach to peace, to constitute an act of aggression, or to constitute a threat to peace. Here, may we can say that by the stipulation of the UN Charter, we are here within concurrent competences between General Assembly and Security Council? No. Here, by the stipulations of the UN Charter, we are within competences reserved only to the Security Council. Within the first perspective, the Security Council examines the conflict within the chapter number 6 of the UN Charter, but within conflict constituting threat to peace, act of aggression, or these cases, here, when examining this conflict, the Security Council will do so within Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and this chapter, within the stipulations of the UN Charter, are reserved only to the Security Council. Within the stipulation of the UN Charter. What can do the Security Council when being within one of these conflicts? What are the dispositions of the Chapter 7 relating to this matter? In fact, within the second perspective of conflict, stipulated in Chapter 7, the Security Council is allowed to adopt one of two categories of resolution, or both of them, but they are distinguished in their nature. The first category of resolution, and they are stipulated in Article 40, are decisions which do not constitute sanctions adopted by the Security Council against one or another of the parties to the conflict. Article 40 stipulates that the Security Council is allowed to adopt resolutions which are not sanctions, and they have the name of provisional measures. Provisional measures. What mean provisional measures? A decision, we'll know that here we are within a binding decision, a decision adopted by the Security Council as to produce its effect by avoiding that the conflict may arise or may continue to produce its effects between the parties. For example, a decision adopted by the Security Council in the aim to impose ceasefire between the parties. A decision, another example, a decision adopted by the Security Council as to send a peacekeeping operation by binding resolution to the region in which the conflict is arising between the parties. Other example, in the recent practice of the Security Council, sometimes also the Security Council sent delegation to suspect the operation of election in some states, to suspect if the democratic technique has been in fact promoted when realizing the election in state, to suspect if the human rights are respected by one state, yes or no. Provisional measures, not constituting sanctions. Article 40. But also, the second category of resolution allowed to the Security Council by the Chapter 7 are the category of resolution, binding resolution, that the Security Council may adopt, and here they are sanctions adopted by the Security Council against one of the parties to the conflict. I mean, here, the Security Council will appreciate the conflict, will decide that the state X, not the state Y, who breach the peace, and then he will adopt a sanction against the state X. Which typologies of sanctions? Within Article 41 and Article 2, it is stipulated that these sanctions are of many examples. Within Article 41, the Security Council may adopt non-military sanctions. I mean sanctions against the states not requiring the recourse to armed force against it. Then economic sanction, cultural one, etc. Within Article 42, the Security Council is allowed to adopt a sanction constituting recourse to armed force by the armed force of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council against the state who has been considered by the Security Council as threatening the peace or committing the act of aggression. Within the practice of the UN after its creation, I have said that within the stipulations of the UN Charter is a second perspective. Conflict constituting breach of peace or act of aggression, that is an exclusive competence for the Security Council, then not allowed to the General Assembly to examine them. All the Chapter 7. After the creation of the UN, in fact, never, from 1946 and until now, never the General Assembly has tried to make concurrence within the Security Council relating to adoption of sanctions. And it will be illegal because it is reserved to the Security Council. As the Security Council adopted sanctions, in exceptional case, because of the right of veto. In exceptional case, in the 19th of last century, once against South Rhodesia and once against South Africa, then against Iraq when occupying Kuwait, once against the beginning of this century against Serbia because committing act of aggression against two other states, which has been within session of last Yugoslavia, I mean Croatia in one hand and Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. For the perspective of the first category of resolutions stipulated in Article 40, binding resolution adopted by the Security Council and not constituting sanctions, as I precluded it by examples, sending force of peace, ceasefire, etc. In fact, within this matter, the practice of the General Assembly gave rise from 1950 to a new practice by which the General Assembly adopts provisional measures sending operation of peace within a majority of 2/3 of the voting states. Legal or illegal? I will say legal. Why? To apprehend that, we have to know that if the resolution is adopted by the Security Council, here, in this case, provisional measures, it is considered by itself as a binding resolution, which must be respected and implemented. But within the practice of the General Assembly, when doing so, it adopts its resolution with at least a majority of 2/3 of the voting states, but the resolution here will be considered as a recommendation, then not binding resolution by itself. Then why the General Assembly will adopt the same resolution if it will not be binding by itself? Because if the concerned states will consent to promote the execution of this resolution, this one will be binding, not because adopted by the General Assembly, but because of the consent of the concerning states. And I give an example. The tripartite war in 1956, because of the right of veto expressly used by France and Great Britain in the Security Council, the Security Council hasn't been in the possibility to adopt provisional measures binding by themselves within Chapter 7. Then, 1 month after, the General Assembly meets in an irregular session to examine this problem and adopt a resolution. Having the name of Union for Peace. Union for Peace. By which the General Assembly decide that when we will be within a conflict constituting an act of aggression, breach to peace, and if the Security Council will not be able to adopt provisional measures regarding to this conflict because of the recourse of one of the permanent members to its right of veto, here the General Assembly may send peacekeeping operation within a resolution adopted by 2/3 of the voting states, but this resolution will not be binding by itself unless accepted by the concerning state. And by this resolution, in fact, we have been within the presence of Israeli troops in Sinai. And by this resolution, the General Assembly decided to send peacekeeping force within the frontiers between Egypt and Israel, within all the frontiers between Egypt and Israel. Egypt consent to the presence of this peacekeeping force in his territory within the frontier with Israel. But Israel refused that this force be present in his territory. That is the consent then, because we have been within the consent of Egypt. Egypt has been in the obligation to respect the resolution and to give legality to the presence of this General Assembly force in Sinai. Israel, no. Israel, no. That is point number 3. Point number 3. Point number 4. The system of vote in the Security Council. Here we are within a principle having only 2 exceptions within the stipulations of the UN Charter. What is the principle? In all matters of the competence of the Security Council regarding accession to new states, to UN, suspension of quality of member, or exclusion, or electing of the General Secretary of the UN, or adopting resolution within the perspective of Chapter 6, or adopting resolution within the perspective of Chapter 7, always the decision of the Security Council must be adopted by a positive vote of at least 9 of its members, including all the permanent members. Then, if we will be within a positive vote of 14 between the member of the Security Council and a veto by a permanent member, the resolution will not be adopted. That is the principle. As by the stipulation of the UN Charter appears exceptions to this principle, yes, 2, only 2, only 2. The first exception relates to the election of the judges of the International Court of Justice. Within the stipulations of the UN Charter, it is clear that it is required here only 9 positive votes at least, without taking into account if the 5 permanent members will vote yes or no. That is the first exception. The second and the latest one. I have said that the Security Council may examine conflicts within one of two perspectives. First one, chapter 6. First one, chapter 6. If we are within a conflict which does not constitute a threat to peace or an act of aggression. A peaceful conflict between two states. And I give the example of a conflict of frontiers between two states. The second perspective, when the Security Council will examine within the Chapter 7 a conflict constituting, yes, a threat to peace or an act of aggression. The second exception relates to the case of the first perspective. What I mean by that? Within the second exception, it is stipulated in the UN Charter. If we are within a peaceful conflict between two states, and if one of them is member of the Security Council, he will not have the right to vote, being permanent or not permanent member. Then if we are, as example, within a peaceful conflict between France and Germany relating to the conflict, to the frontiers between them, and it is a peaceful conflict, and if this conflict will be examined by the Security Council, here France will not have the right to vote. Abstain to vote. Abstain to vote. Tunisia now is non-permanent of the Security Council. If a peaceful conflict arises between Tunisia and Algeria, for example, Tunisia will have the obligation to abstain to vote. That is the second exception. As the last one, system of vote. Last point, the binding force of resolutions adopted by the Security Council. Easy and clear. If the Security Council adopts a resolution by referring it to Chapter 6, here we will be within a recommendation adopted by the Security Council. This resolution will not be by itself binding. And to be respected by the parties, it must be accepted by them. Not binding resolution. As for the General Assembly. As for the General Assembly. Recommendations. But if the Security Council decide to examine the conflict within Chapter 7, considering then that the conflict constitutes breach to peace or an act of aggression, the decision adopted in this case by the Security Council are binding by themselves, must be respected. First of all, by the parties to the conflict. Second, by all the members of the UN. 3, even by states who are not members in the UN. But within a condition that the decision must be legal. I mean what by legal? Must be conform to the UN Charter. And you remember that we have examined in the part 1 the problematic of the legality of the resolution adopted by the principals organs of international organization. Then, for point number 1, the last one, that is the solution. Chapter 6, recommendation. Chapter 7, binding resolution. But here may appear, and it appears in practice, not only in theory, a question: as the Security Council, when adopting its resolution refer by explicit disposition to chapter 6 or chapter 7. Example, after the aggression of Israel against some Arab states, including Egypt, the Security Council adopted in November 1967 a resolution having the name Resolution 242. As in this resolution, the Security Council stipulates that it adopt it within chapter 6, within chapter 7? No. And that is not only in the case of this conflict of 1967. As a principle, in fact, in the practice of the Security Council, the Security Council, when adopting its resolution, doesn't make express reference to if its resolution is adopted within chapter 7 or within chapter 6. Then how states will be able, if it is so, to conclude if the resolution is by itself binding, because adopted within chapter 7, or recommendation, because adopted within chapter 6. In fact, that is the stipulation of the resolution itself. In the stipulation of the resolution, it will be said by the Security Council in the resolution that this resolution is adopted to make stop to the war between state X and state Y. Then we are here within a case, at least, if I will not say an act of aggression, because the Security Council haven't yet decided who is the aggressor, we are at least within a case of threat to peace. No peace. We are within transformation in the relation between the two states from the time of peace to the time of war. Then we can apprehend that the resolution in this case will be adopted within chapter 7 and then binding by itself. And then binding by itself. Then that is so for today. And as I've said, for the exam only, aims of UN and principles, 2, General Assembly, 3, the Security Council. Then we will not examine the other principal or subsidiary organs of the UN. And for the next course, we will have to examine together, we'll begin to examine together the chapter relating to the Universal Specialized International Organization. The Universal Specialized International Organization, having the name in the book, Chapter 7, UN Specialized Agencies. UN Specialized Agency from page 221, from page 221. It will be for the next course. Thank you so much, dear students.